action, focus, discipline. This is the Zero Excuses podcast. Each and every week, we talk to high-performing, inspirational athletes, entrepreneurs, and leaders. We ask powerful questions to extract their tools, strategies, and life lessons for you to crush your excuses, to break out of your comfort zone, and accomplish your ambitious dreams and goals. Here's your host, Kenyon HERE.
What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to the podcast. Thank you for taking time out of your schedules to spend a few minutes with me and also spend a few minutes with today's guest, Peter Lazaroff. He's got a lot of practical, simple knowledge around investing and managing one's money. You're definitely going to want to take some notes. He really has some simple, straightforward, and practical tips and advice for us today. And you know, there's never enough knowledge that you can soak up around money, and Peter gives us a very hefty dose of that today. But before we get into today's show, I have a couple quick reminders first. Don't forget that we are dropping our next iteration of the Discipline Deep Dive program. Had a successful launch back in April, and we're doing it again here in August. If you are interested in installing the systems and the habits and the routines that you need to have that consistent discipline in your life, you're definitely going to want to join. You can just go over to kenyonzitska.com/DDD to get signed up. If you have any questions, feel free to hit me up, kenyon.zitska@gmail.com, and we'll get you set up. And last reminder I have for you guys is I've been noticing a serious uptick in the number of ratings and reviews left on iTunes, and I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to do that. It's really helped out get the word out what we're doing here on the show, and it's also helped new listeners find us, so I appreciate that. And if you haven't already done so, just go to kenyonzitska.com/iTunes, and I'll take you right to the Zero Excuses iTunes podcast homepage, and you can leave us a rating and a review, and also subscribe and share the show with a friend or family member. All right, with all that, let's get into today's interview with Peter. Peter, thanks for taking time out of your evening to join us here on the Zero Excuses podcast. I know we've been batting this thing around a couple times here, and finally able to connect here tonight. So glad to have you on.
Yeah, thanks, Kenyon. I appreciate being here.
So, Peter, you are a financial advisor, and I was reading your background prior to recording this episode, and I know you've got a passion for helping people break down complex financial problems into simple parts. And I know this started for you at a very early age. But before we get into all that, why don't you give yourself a brief introduction, tell the audience who you are and what you do today.
Sure. So my regular day job is that of being the chief investment officer at Plan Corp, which is a national investment advisor, wealth management firm with offices from East to West Coast. And in that role, my general expectation is to be managing the $4 billion in client assets we have, developing the investment policy, and then communicating that policy. And so when you mentioned the passion for simplifying things, it's really easy to get caught up in the complexities of an investment portfolio as well as a financial plan. But I feel like it doesn't have to be that hard. And I take a lot of great pride in distilling down that information into easily digestible lessons. And so most of my time is spent at Plan Corp. We also have a second company called Bright Plan, which is a robo-advisor, digital advisor in the space where instead of just a few buttons in your investing, it's a few buttons and you are building a financial plan. So we've sort of flipped the current model that you see with most robo-advisors out there on its head. It takes a lot more keystrokes to get an investment, but you also come out of it with a financial plan. So that's been pretty cool. And then finally, I just had a book come out called Making Money Simple, when the whole purpose of that was to create a blueprint for turning some career success into financial success. For me personally, I feel like my wife and I have done pretty well, and it's nothing to do with earning outlandish incomes. It really just has to do with setting up a process that systematically nudges your finances in the right direction and does so with minimal effort on your part. So for me, I'm a huge finance nerd. I mean, in my free time, I definitely love some baseball and football and reading and traveling and family. But when the book was originated, it was mostly out of a passion of I write all the time for my website, peterlazaroff.com. I write for Forbes and Wall Street Journal. I wanted to do something a little bigger that people could take and then have an easy framework that's really actionable right away.
Awesome. Well, thanks for all that. So, where did this passion start for you? Was it something that was it something you decided to go, needed a career after graduating high school, or did this start for you prior to that?
So I'm fairly certain that the passion began when my grandmother gave me a share of Nike stock for my 12th birthday. And I have a December 20th birthday. And you can imagine me around Christmas time expecting to get video games or like skateboard or something like that. And I get a stock and I think, what in the world? And she started talking to me a little bit about it, and there would be dividend checks that came in the mail, and the Nike stock split. And so suddenly, instead of having one shares, within a few weeks, I had two shares just because it happened to split. And a few months later, because it was really cooking back then, it split again. And so suddenly I was getting these dividend income checks. And I thought, this is really cool. And I wasn't a huge reader when I was young, but I certainly was interested in this thing that was going up in value and paying me income when I did nothing. And so I did read some investors for beginners books, and I started reading periodicals here and there. I certainly wasn't like reading the paper every day. I was still 12 and 13, 14, but
Yeah.
ultimately I got pretty passionate about making good money decisions at an early age and started trying to work any job I could. And to me, finances at that age was sort of like a puzzle that could be solved, and just trying to find solutions and make the most out of it was really attractive to me.
Yeah. So it sounds like you had well, at least from different from my experience in that, you were taught at an early age that you don't have to necessarily work at a 9 to 5 job to earn an income. There's more than one way to do that. And I think, at least in the circles I ran in growing up, the common thinking was, graduate from high school, get a good job, work that 9 to 5 until you're 60-ish years old, and fast forward to today, and I'm really starting to rewrite that mental model of mine, and I know that I really wish that I learned a lot more about finances when I was growing up, and I know that in high school and schools around America, that's not taught very much. Even simple things like balancing a checkbook are not taught. So, what was your family? I know you mentioned your grandmother gave you a share of Nike stock. What was the rest of your upbringing like? Were you kind of blue collar, or what was that like?
My parents both worked in the medical field. And so, I was really fortunate. For example, like they paid for my college, which was tremendous, but, we didn't really speak that much about money, and it wasn't an off limits topic. So if I had a question, it would be answered. But my parents were not financially, I don't want to say they weren't savvy, but they weren't experts. They did things that I look back on today and say, oh, with a little bit better advice, they might have grown their wealth more quickly. But the thing that they did that really stuck out to me, and I think was most important, is that they never spent more than they earned. And they did voice that. I think that was a really important lesson. And they really encouraged my savings. So I know when I first had an income job, my dad was willing to match whatever I put of that job into a Roth. And so that was a really big benefit. And I tell people that all the time. People will save for their kids' future. And the second they get an income, go ahead and match their Roth. Show them how amazing this account is. Because I didn't know back then that it was retirement account gold. But generally speaking, it really was. And to think that I've had money in there for a decade almost by the time I'd gotten out of college is pretty amazing. And so, my parents, again, they didn't make intentional lessons, but if there was a money question at the dinner table, they answered it. I remember when my dad started a business, him kind of telling everybody, hey, like money could be tight. Like if we've never done this before. He was a doctor. He had not gone to business school, so he wasn't sure what starting his own practice would look like. And I think I was really fortunate with that stock lesson from my grandmother. And then my grandfather from the other side of the family also somewhat had a passion for stocks. And it was one of the things I think he really enjoyed talking to me as a young adult. and seeing them and having them encourage questions about that, I think really continued to further the knowledge. But I am one of those strange people who maybe in high school had a sense of what they wanted to do with their career and then went to college and graduated and had that turn out to be correct. I think that's very, very unusual. And certainly, as you said, your upbringing can change a lot of your money perspectives. They don't teach it in school. At the same time, if they did teach it in school to you when you're a junior or senior, would you really remember what type of mortgage to get when you go to buy your first house? But the financial literacy in our country is shockingly low. And I'd like to hope that some of the things that I write and some of the content that I produce, will help people change even just one aspect of their life. Because if you make one change, no matter how big or small, that change can compound for several decades and turn out to be something enormous in the end.
Yeah, and a lot of people get started way too late planning their financial futures, and that is one thing that my father also just distilled down to me was, hey, you know what, save, 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 and save early and often. And very similar situation. He kind of matched some of my contributions to a retirement fund that he got started for me. I forget how much I earned or not earned, but was gifted at my high school graduation. But I just gave it all to my dad and like, hey, let's invest this money because I mean I was about ready to ship off to the Navy, so I really didn't have anything to spend it on to go to boot camp.
When
But
you
yep,
put in a Roth at that age, you got 40 years until you touch it. I mean, that's,
yeah,
going to be a truly life-changing amount after 40, no matter how
yeah,
little the initial contribution, with 40 years of compounding, it makes a huge difference.
absolutely, yep. But
Well, and I know you said you have kids. I mean, I'll just share one other quick
yeah,
piece. Is I, and part of when I started writing the book, I realized that my parents hadn't spoken to me that much about money, and my son was 4 at the time when I first wrote my first word of the book, and I decided to give him an allowance. And it was really an interesting experiment. I'd say it's actually gone very well because he's asked so many questions about money. Now they could all backfire on me at some point, but the money discussions are really honest, and the way that we divide up his allowance into a save jar and a spend jar and a share jar. My hope is that if us parents are the real people who are supposed to teach our children, my hope is to be a little more proactive, and maybe he'll make good decisions eventually as he gets older.
yeah. I'm jotting down a lot of notes here as we are talking too, because I've got a 4-year-old daughter too, and she's got her little bunny bank, as she likes to
Oh
call
yeah.
it, and she's always if I leave I left a $20 bill on the kitchen counter one night, I see this little hand reach up and like that's my bunny bank. So we don't give our kids enough credit sometimes too, that they can start to understand the concept of money a lot earlier than we sometimes give them credit for. So
Right. Well, and I think because you're a savvy money person yourself, you're not afraid to go there. Whereas I think most parents don't start an allowance because they don't know how to talk about money themselves. And so, again, all these things I seek to try to help people with. And I even wrote about the allowance. And I remember there was so much feedback from parents being like, "Oh my gosh, we're going to start doing that too." And I said, "Great. Like give me feedback on what you hear, and let's all go through this together."
yeah, so is it just a straight up allowance, or is this hey, you got to do some chores, do they got to earn it somehow?
It's a really good question. All of the research says you should not tie the allowance to the chores.
Yeah,
I'm a little more than a year in, and I got to tell you, I really want to tie it to the chores. Have like a sticker chart, but typically, the after doing a lot of reading, it said 50 cents to a dollar for each year of the child's age. So my kid's 5, and we give him $5, and he puts 3. He always has to put 1 in share. And he has to put at least 1 in save, but he typically does 1 share, 1 spend, 3 save. And when he was 4, he did 2 save, 1 spend, 1 share. But if he doesn't ask for his allowance, if he forgets it, I don't tell him, and
yeah,
we don't play catch up. But there's a lot of research that says that doing chores is part of living as a unit and living in the household. So that's what we're trying to do. I'm going to be honest, I'm not sure that it's ideal. It would be really easy to attach chores, and that there's extra work. He's offered once to help rake the leaves, and he's not physically capable of really doing it, but he was outside with me for a long time. I'm like, yep, I'll pay you for that. At that point he was 5. I'm happy to throw him a few extra bucks, which he thought was like $1 million. So
Yeah, make it like a bonus type thing. Yeah.
yeah.
Anyways, but I know we've been talking a lot about retirement savings. Are there? Do you help people start generating maybe a steady stream of income currently? Is that something that you also help people do?
Yeah. So when someone comes to us at Plan Corp, the first thing is to map out like what your goals are. And in my book, Making Money Simple, the first chapter is actually on the power of compounding because I think it just is so important. But the next chapter is, let's start with the end in mind. What are your goals? What are you trying to accomplish? Because if you tell me, if you're clear with yourself, if you can be so clear that you can write it down in a sentence or at least speak it to me pretty concisely, you're going to be pretty clear about what steps need to be taken to get there. And so if that's creating passive income in the present, you will do different things with your money than you would do if you say, I'm really just worried about starting an income stream at age 60 or 70. So, certainly those are things we do. And whether you own businesses, if you're more interested in a passive income stream, we might not be as encouraging to have you reinvest in your business. So it's a delicate balance. It's all goals driven. What you want for your kids, what you want your kids. So if you want to pay for your kids' school rather than them taking loans, that can certainly play a role. But generally speaking, my general feeling with passive income is that you shouldn't really do anything until you contribute something towards the end retirement. That I'm not going to have any sort of working income to fall on, passive or otherwise. And you shouldn't do it unless you have some sort of an emergency fund, because a lot of things that generate passive income are less liquid. And that's not inherently bad, but you really do have to have some kind of emergency fund in place. I love it when people have 3 to 6 months of expenses in an emergency fund. Now, that's not the type of thing that gets built up overnight, and you shouldn't expect it to be. But certainly contributing something, and if that's the end goal, and even if it takes several years, fine. Those are kind of the two pieces: the retirement savings, something towards it, and the emergency fund that I would tend to focus on before telling someone, let's focus on that passive income, or let's, focus on buying a house or dream
Right.
vacation or college education, et cetera.
Awesome. So I mean, that's so important, that emergency fund. That's something that a lot of people overlook. And I'm a government employee, and if I didn't have some sort of way to access funds when the government shut down, I would have been in a sticky situation like so many government workers that deal with paycheck to paycheck found themselves in. But
Yeah.
what are some of the methods that you steer people towards once they kind of get this foundation in place for starting those passive income?
Well, again, so you set the goals, and I think if the number one goal, like I said, is retirement, and 1A is 1A is retirement, 1B is emergency fund. If you're interested in passive income, the key is to then understand how much do you spend. So, if passive income is probably just going to be one of your goals, because passive income takes a lot of work, and I think that's a big misconception about passive income. There is an unbelievable amount of hustle. And in many ways, what the dream of passive income is just financial independence. And so, for our clients at Plan Corp or at Bright Plan, when you're building plans on the digital platform or human with Plan Corp, financial independence, you can model a lot of different things and try to understand what the different opportunities are. Now, in my opinion, I think it's very rare that if your long-term goal is passive income, that a portfolio should be the primary source of it. I think if you're thinking passive income, you really have to think, how can I earn more from changing the way I work? And changing the way I work can be getting a second job or starting a business or investing in a business. But I think personally, when you're going to use a portfolio with something that is so volatile and so unpredictable, if you're going to depend on that passive income, I'm really not a fan of using the portfolio to generate it. I definitely realize that there are a lot of people who have a portion of their passive income come from a bond portfolio, for example. And that's fine. I think it's all relative. But generally speaking, the next step for us for financial independence is to figure out, okay, here are my goals. here's what I have today. Here's what I spend, arguably the most important input and the one that people get wrong the most. Where do I have to put money next to make this goal happen as fast as possible? Now, if you own real estate, if we're going on the passive income stream, or you have a business that generates some income, looking at that and look at the tax returns and trying to understand where can we save money or save money on taxes or make something more efficient or funnel your finances through different vehicles such that that goal is achieved faster.
Yeah, I think you mentioned something very, very important. A lot of people are focused on spending less money or increasing their income, but they're not focused on keeping what they do earn, and that's by reducing their tax burden. What are some of the common things that you find with the clients that you work with that they kind of overlook and don't think about when they today's tax day, ironically, that we're recording this. So this is a very relevant topic. What do people miss?
So good tax planning, in my opinion, is all about eliminating surprises. And since it's tax day today, and since I've spoken to so many people about this, I mean, most people heard that there was tax reform and that there was going to be a big tax cut, but they didn't change their withholdings. And so they may have actually paid less taxes in the grand scheme of things, but they owe the government money today, as opposed to getting a refund. So I think eliminating surprises is what really good tax planning is all about. Is you think about lowering taxes and doing so in a way that aligns with your values and aligns with your goals. The tax code has gotten such that it is trickier because the standard deduction is so high. You really have to be creative. So if you're charitable, maybe you bunch several years of donations into a single charitable gift to a donor advised fund, and that can give you higher itemized deductions than you would have received otherwise in this calendar year. And then you just take the standard deduction as you're gifting out of this donor advised fund. I mean, I think that's been a really popular strategy, finding ways to accelerate or decelerate taxes into certain tax years. So when there was tax reform, we were able to accelerate state and local income tax payments, accelerate them forward so that you got the full benefit of the deduction. There's always going to be tax law change. And so just understanding the law and understanding, there's not intentional loopholes here, but there is always going to be something that you can do. And perhaps the biggest mistake people make is assuming that because they're getting help with someone, that they're absolutely going to minimize their taxes. I think there's a lot of people in the world who are tax preparers in my mind, and then there's a smaller group of people who are true accountants and truly provide the tax planning that's going to make an income. And if you have any sort of a business, my goodness, you can really take advantage of it, but you have to know how. And the tax planning software is fine. It's great that TurboTax and H&R Block have products that are easy to use, but generally speaking, you're going to have to speak with a human that can take advantage of that. And I know that's something that PlanCorp has prided themselves on a long time is, look, anybody can invest your money these days. There are digital platforms that do it for relatively cheap. So if you're using a human advisor, they have to add value on tax, on estate planning, on cash flow management. And that's certainly something we take a lot of pride in.
Yeah, and so many people do go to those those stores in the mall to get their taxes done. And yeah, they might get a pretty sizable return, but there's, if you have any sort of business, you'd be wise to actually use a CPA and or some sort of accountant to do that.
Well,
and someone that's in a niche too.
Right. And if you're getting a sizable return, I mean, that might be because you were paying too much in taxes throughout the year. Your withholding was wrong. And the challenge with someone who, really earns their, as a tax preparer where they just really file returns, there's no proactive planning. They would know, oh, hey, how much are you having withheld? And they get celebrated for getting you a big return, and it's in their best interest not to tell you to change your withholding. But when you get a big return, all that means is that you just gave the government an interest-free loan. And so big returns, they're not necessarily a good thing. What you're going for is smallest amount of taxes paid, and how that payment comes over time, from a pure math standpoint, doesn't matter. Now, look, we don't live in a spreadsheet. Like, I totally get that. But I do think that it's something that goes overlooked for people who have a business, for people who are trying to grow wealth. It's one of those things where, as I mentioned, sort of at the beginning of the show, you make one change if you say, okay, the only change I'm going to make in my financial life is the amount of taxes I pay. Well, every $100 or every $1,000 or every $10,000 you save in taxes compounds over time again, and turns out to be something pretty substantial.
Yeah, and another misconception that I'm surprised more people don't realize is that the most common way that we earn a living here in America, earned income, is the most heavily taxed form of income as well. So
Sure.
people get wrapped around the axle about the dividend taxes and capital gains taxes. Well, though, like the tax rate on those is a lot lower than earned income. So if all of your income is capital gains or ordinary dividend income, your tax burden is lower. So, you know, like you said, proper planning is really key there.
Well, and imagine you get to retirement and you're probably using some sort of tax deferred accounts over time, IRAs, Roth IRAs, HSAs. There's planning around that too. So at some point when you're in that withdrawal phase, whether you're 59 and a half or 75, you got to be thoughtful about the way that money comes out. And you can strategically do Roth conversions at different points in time in life, and those have enormous impact. And I guess for the listeners that don't, by saying Roth conversions so nonchalantly, I mean, just taking your IRA assets and converting that into a Roth IRA and paying taxes today so that the assets in the Roth are not going to be taxed on the way out. That's a pretty big benefit. Now, on the other hand, we could look at it and say, well, tax law always changes, and who knows, they may change the rules about the Roth someday. They may say that if your Roth is a certain size, it's going to be taxed, or they may add some form of national sales tax. I mean, Europe has a tax that effectively acts as such, and it's hard to really know. And so tax diversification within your savings is also an important piece, because we can only really know what today is, and use probabilities to plan as best as we can.
Yep. Yeah, and that Roth conversion is something I'm going through right now. I've got a small qualified retirement plan that I'm kind of managing myself, and I'm converting over to Roth and then making investments on that in land, getting tax free 3 to 4%, 3 to 4x return, tax free. Like you said, today, maybe that changes down the road, but people don't, that they just stick money in their 401k and kind of forget about it. They don't realize, like, hey, you know what? If I slowly convert all that over time, all the gains that I get, I can have a tax-free retirement.
Yeah.
But so let's shift gears a little bit here and let people know how they can get in touch with you, and how can they get a hold of the book, and maybe if they're interested in what we've been talking about here, how can they start working with you to enact some of these strategies.
Sure. Well, so let's start with a thing that I'm focusing on so much these days, it feels like, is the book is called Making Money Simple. The subtitle that makes the book title really long is The Complete Guide to Keeping Your Financial House in Order. The Complete Guide to Getting Your Financial House in Order and Keeping It That Way Forever. Of course, when you see the cover, it just says Making Money Simple really large. So it's nice and easy. You can get that anywhere books are sold. The other thing that I think listeners might find useful is I developed a financial wellness assessment. It's called smartmoneyquiz.com. And Smart Money Quiz is really just designed to take a look at a broad overview of your finances. It's 9 questions long, and the way I built it out is based on the way that you've answered those questions. You should get 3 or 4 things that you are doing well or not doing well and need some attention, as well as some resources right out the gate. So if you're looking for something highly actionable and fast, I think smartmoney.com is a great place to start. The other thing is, in my book, I have a bunch of worksheets, and they're the same worksheets that I used when I was 22. They're the same worksheets that my wife and I use today. They're the same worksheets that we use at Plan Corp and that we built Bright Plan off of. And ultimately, if you download what I think to be of the 3 core worksheets, one's a goal worksheet, one's a cash flow worksheet, one's a net worth worksheet, you can sort of create this reverse budget that gets you really on track for any sort of goal you set. And in the book, it's peterlazaroff.com/worksheets. But if you make it to peterlazaroff.com, and I'm sure Lazaroff is not the easiest thing to spell, so maybe you'll be able to find them in the show notes. But generally speaking, if you Google me and you misspell my name, Google seems to be figuring it out pretty well. Otherwise, smartmoneyquiz.com is relatively easy to spell.
Yeah, for sure. I'll definitely put all of these resources and links in the show notes, so listeners have no excuse not to get out there and download all this financial goodness that we've been talking about tonight. Uh, as we wind down here, is there anything, any golden nuggets that you want to leave the listeners with that we might not have touched on?
Yeah, well, I think if people are interested in learning more about the technical side of investing, the one thing I was really proud about with the book is the first third of the book is all about setting this framework for making good money decisions, and it's highly actionable. It's driven by these worksheets. The second section, I think, did something that I felt like most personal finance books don't attempt to do, which is tackle some of the theory on investments, not just the how do I do it, but the why and why do I do it this way. I think a lot of people understand you should use low cost investments. You shouldn't try to predict the future. I think what few people realize is the power of markets and the nature of the competition that's out there. And so my job as chief investment officer, my daily job is really to manage $4 billion in assets. And so I took a stab at trying to explain some of my core investment beliefs in the plainest of English that I possibly can. So like if my wife and my parents and some of my friends can't understand it, then I would have failed readers. But I am really excited about that. And I think that some of the things you'll learn in there, that good investing, it really just comes down to minimizing mistakes and staying the heck out of compound interest way. But how you do that by looking at what mistakes investors do make over time most commonly, my hope is that you'll look at these things and say, yeah, I guess I've done that before, or I have thought about that. A great example is, okay, do you think the people who buy Facebook or Amazon are really trying to beat the market? And they would never tell you they're trying to beat the market, but anytime you're owning anything other than the entire market, you are trying to beat it, whether you mean to or not. Similarly, I think the psychology behind market losses is a really important part. So look, stock market's been up for 10 years and we've had a couple drops, but nothing really that substantial. And so there's a large section there talking about the normalcy of losses. And I don't think there's a meeting I have been in since I've been at Plan Corp. I've been at Plan Corp a little over 4 years. I don't think there's any client meeting I've ever been in where we didn't talk about losses and remind people, hey, like every 12 months on average, the market's going to drop 10%. And every 3 years on average, the market's going to drop 20%. And when you hear those numbers and the market goes down, your instincts are going to be, this is scary, I'm going to run. So, evolutionarily speaking, our ancestors heard a rustle in the bushes. They didn't calculate the probability as a lion. They just took off and run. For investors, all our instincts are backwards. And so while I acknowledge you can't take human nature out of a human, you really do have to build systems around it. And so, I know we didn't jump into a lot of the investing, but I just wanted to throw it out there. If you are into some of the technical stuff, without being like an investment expert, I do think you can get a lot out of the book, particularly in the second third of the book, all there.
Yeah, most people will get real nervous when they see the market taking a dive, but like stocks are going on sale. That's when you need to start maybe investing a little bit in the market, because it's gonna come back.
Yeah. And if you're automated, the more of your plan that's automated, the less likely you can get in your way. Certainly, the best thing is just to not look at it. If you look at the market every day, there's not quite a 50-50 chance you're going to see a loss, but there's a lot of research that shows when we see losses, we start doing silly things. So the less frequently you look, the more likely you're going to see that the market or your portfolio or both are up. And it's unrealistic for me to say, hey, like, just don't check your portfolio more than once every 10 years. If you could do that, like, boy, you're really great. But in reality, that's a little bit unrealistic. But certainly our phones have made it so easy to notice the changes in our wealth. It's a double-edged sword, because I'm a big believer in the financial technology. I think looking at my transactions every day and seeing my bank account balances is a really productive, may not be keeping track of the absolute number, but just seeing the transactions is really productive to making good financial decisions. But seeing my portfolio value going up and down, that's not that helpful, particularly if I see my portfolio value get sliced in half like it did in 2007 through 2009. And so I think especially for people who are relying on their portfolio for income, it's even more scary, and understanding you really can't bail, because once that risk, that is the price you pay in exchange for higher expected returns in stocks. It's part of a healthy, normal functioning market. And we've had really good fortune. We did have nearly a 20% drop in the last quarter of 2018, but still, it's relatively been a quiet ride up since the financial crisis.
Yeah, and people just definitely take Peter's advice here and just kind of ride it out. And as long as you don't need the money right now, there's nothing to really get too worked up over. But Peter, this has been a fascinating discussion, and we'll have to link back up here in the future, maybe do a part 2, and maybe you'll have a second book out by then. And this is, like I said, it's been a fascinating discussion, and appreciate your time here tonight, and keep in touch.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for tuning in to the Zero Excuses podcast. Join the conversation at kenyonhere.com in our Facebook group. And don't forget to rate and subscribe to our show. We'll talk to you next week. And always remember, results, not excuses.